Our keynote speaker tonight is James Taranto, who I happily met earlier. James is the opinion editor at the Wall Street Journal. Previously, he wrote the popular Best of the Web column for WSJ.com, and in 2007, he was named a member of the journal's editorial board. James was also an editor and columnist at opinionjournal.com. In the past, James also served as an editor at City Journal, the Manhattan Institute's Quarterly of Public Policy, worked for the Heritage Foundation, United Press International, and more. I could really go on, so I'll cut it short so that we can hear him. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker, Wall Street Journal's opinion editor, James Taranto.
Well, thank you. David asked me to say a few words about something having to do with Judaism and journalism. And I thought I'd get up here and talk about media coverage of Israel or anti-Semitism, but I probably couldn't tell you anything that this audience doesn't already know. So I thought I'd take a different approach, which is I'm going to start with an observation about Judaism and then use that as a jumping off point to make some more general observations about journalism. The observation about Judaism comes from a scholar named Reuben Brenner from McGill University. He wrote a piece that I published about a month and a half ago called The Roots of Anti-Semitism, in which he raised the question, what is it about the Jews that inspires such hatred through the ages? And writing about the early history of the Jews, he writes, for accidental reasons, Jews have constantly found themselves opposing dominant ideologies of the times. That's times lowercase. Thousands of years ago, they bet on a religion drawing on a sacred book. The rest of the world was still illiterate, betting on oral traditions and local deities. Memories are mutable, and among illiterates lead to flexible behavior. In contrast, a literal religion anchored and guided people, a literate religion, anchored and guided people, no matter where they found themselves, reluctant to accept newer books, sacred or not. Hellenistic rulers complained that only Jews among all conquered nations refused to adopt Greek laws and beliefs. Both the Greeks and later Roman and Christian authorities interpreted the Jews' adherence to their faith as a refusal to recognize the authority of the state. Now, thinking about journalism, when journalists take themselves seriously, they like to think of themselves, well, there's this expression, journalism is the first draft of history. We like to think of ourselves as engaged in a serious enterprise of reporting the truth. It's the first draft, so maybe we don't get it exactly right, maybe we don't know everything, but there's a certain, it's a literate pursuit, just like the early Jewish religion. But I feel that journalism has sort of regressed in the direction of oral tradition, folklore. And a lot of this is driven by social media. For example, you see this constantly happens on Twitter. Some journalist will tweet something that turns out to be completely wrong, and then he'll tweet a correction. And the first thing, which plays into people's prejudices, gets all kinds of retweets, and the second thing doesn't. So here's an example from July 10th, I believe that's yesterday, right? Guy from NBC, I think it's their White House correspondent, tweets the following. Source familiar tells NBC that Justice Kennedy had been in negotiations with the Trump team for months over Kennedy's replacement. Once Kennedy received assurances that it would be Kavanaugh, his former law clerk, Kennedy felt comfortable retiring. All right, this gets, at the time that somebody tweeted screenshots of these two tweets, this has 16.3K, 16,300 retweets. And then there's the follow-up. Just as an important clarification from @LA Caldwell DC, that's his colleague who reported this, on this earlier reporting. And basically the clarification is, this was just some nut talking, it's not true. That has 40 retweets at the time of the thing. So a difference of 3 orders of magnitude. Excuse me, sometimes you'll find things, this is something I noticed in a New York Times news story today about the cave rescue in Thailand. There's this sentence that's just a total non sequitur. For many people around the world, Thailand's extraordinary operation to save 12 boys and their coach was a welcome contrast to the images of the United States separating immigrant children from their parents and locking them up. So this is attributed to many people around the world. There is not a single quote in this piece backing this up. There's no evidence that anyone other than the reporter or perhaps the editor found this to be true. There's no quote. There's no other mention of the immigration business. It's just a complete non sequitur. And note the form here, for many people around the world, right? It's like the kids on the playground saying, everyone thinks you're weird. I mean, it's that quality, but it's complete folklore. It's just completely made up. And then there are these crazy fact checks. All right, so here's the latest example of this. This is from PolitiFact. They're checking a statement from the Republican candidate for Senate in Missouri. And this is his statement that they're checking. Claire McCaskill, who's the incumbent, the Democrat, voted for 100% of President Obama's judicial nominees. Now, as a matter of fact, Claire McCaskill did vote for 100% of President Obama's judicial nominees. So they rate this mostly true. And here's the explanation. 82% of Obama's nominees received minimal opposition from Republicans. 82% support is lower than the 100% support rate for McCaskill, but it does make Hawley's seemingly black and white contrast between hardline Republican opposition to Obama's picks and blanket Democratic support a bit blurrier. So they take a statement that's completely factual. They say it's mostly true because of this ridiculous nitpicking. That's the first draft of history. If I were the historian, I would send that back. Now, here's my favorite example. And I think this is one of the great scandals of journalism of the past decade. I seem to be the only one who thinks that, which tells you something about the state of journalism. In 2011, you may recall, a gunman in Tucson, Arizona, shot a bunch of people, including a member of Congress, Gabby Giffords. She survived. I think 5 people were killed, including a federal judge. Gabby Giffords was a Democrat who had supported Obamacare, so there was immediately speculation that this might have been politically motivated, a Tea Party guy, an angry right-winger, and so forth. Within a day or two, it was clear that that wasn't the case, that this guy was just a nut who had no discernible political motive. But there were these oral traditions, urban legends, as we call them today, that started to spread. I noticed my liberal Facebook friends, and I have a few of them, were blaming this on Sarah Palin, because Palin's Political Action Committee had a map the previous year with districts that they were targeting to defeat the members of Congress. And they had what were described as crosshairs. They were actually printer's marks on the map of the state. And I actually made a point of going into the comments and saying, look, this isn't true. The guy has no discernible political motive. So the New York Times runs an editorial a couple of days after the shooting, when it's clear that there's no discernible political motive. And here's what they write. It is facile and mistaken to attribute this particular madman's act directly to Republicans or Tea Party members. But it is legitimate to hold Republicans, and particularly their most virulent supporters in the media, responsible for the gale of anger that has produced the vast majority of these threats, setting the nation on edge. Many on the right have exploited the arguments of division, reaping political power by demonizing immigrants or welfare recipients or bureaucrats. They seem to have persuaded many Americans that the government is not just misguided, but the enemy of the people. That whirlwind has touched down most forcefully in Arizona. Now, what the Times is doing here is lying, but they're lying in a very careful way. They haven't actually made any direct factual misstatements, right? PolitiFact wouldn't be able to say, this statement is wrong. But what they are doing is they're drawing a connection that we know by the time they wrote this editorial, there was no connection between this crime and their political opponents and their critics in the media. Fast forward 6.5 years. There's another shooting of a congressman last June. Steve Scalise is shot and gravely wounded. A couple of other people are shot at this baseball game in Arlington, Virginia. By the way, that guy does actually seem to have had some discernible political motives, at least to go by his Facebook page. But you still can't blame anyone but him for the killing. So the Times publishes an editorial. The Times, by this point, has a new editorial page editor. And here's what they write. In 2011, when Jared Lee Loughner opened fire in a supermarket parking lot, grievously wounding Representative Gabby Giffords and killing 6 people, including a 9-year-old girl, The link to political incitement was clear. Before the shooting, Sarah Palin's Political Action Committee circulated a map of targeted electoral districts that put Ms. Giffords and 19 other Democrats under stylized crosshairs. Conservatives and right-wing media were quick on Wednesday to demand forceful condemnation of hate speech and crimes by anti-Trump liberals. They're right. Though there's no sign of incitement as direct as in the Giffords attack, liberals should of course hold themselves to the same standard of decency that they ask of the right. Now, what happened here? Well, apparently, this new editor absorbed the oral tradition, the completely false story that had been spread on places like Facebook. He didn't go back and look at what the Times had reported and what the editorial had written at the time. So he just got careless as hell. The next day, of course, he had to run a correction. An editorial on Thursday about the shooting of Representative Steve Scalise incorrectly stated that a link existed between political rhetoric and the 2011 shooting of Representative Gabby Gifford. In fact, no such link was established. The editorial also incorrectly described a map distributed by a political action committee before that shooting. It depicted electoral districts, not individual Democratic lawmakers, beneath stylized crosshairs. So they finally told the truth 6.5 years later. But wouldn't it have been easier to take care to tell the truth to begin with? Thank you.